Is Bob Lazar legit or a fraud? This is one of the most fascinating questions in all of ufology. Let's get into it. This is Cosmic Road, where I discuss UFOs and the paranormal. Please hit like, please subscribe, share on social media, and as I'm going through this, please comment below and let me know what you think. First, a backseat break. Yeah, that's a cute cat. Okay, this is taken from UFOjoe.net. This is an interview between Dr. Eric Davis and UFO Joe Murgia. A lot of you will know who he is, and of course, most of you will know Dr. Eric Davis, one of the prominent scientists that have investigated the phenomenon over the years. At least one of the most prominent scientists in the public purview, along with Dr. Hal Puthoff. Of course, the government has been involved in this for many years, and there will have been teams and whole armies of scientists that have investigated this. But we don't know about that, and we certainly don't know their names. But that is not the case with Dr. Eric Davis, who was one of the lead investigators, for example, at Skinwalker Ranch. So what is his take on Bob Lazar? Well, he does not think Bob Lazar is legit at all. He thinks Bob is a big faker. So his exact quote is, "Lazar isn't worth a documentary." That's right there. Joe replies, "Well, you might want to see the documentary first before making such a judgment, Eric. Unless maybe you've seen a rough cut of the film. George Knapp has spoken about how some witnesses he tried to speak to about Lazar were harassed and in some cases threatened. That in itself tells me Bob had something to say that certain people didn't want corroborated. This transcript of an excerpt from C2C alone makes me want to see a doc about Bob. Back when C2C was a must listen. Now it's only when JK hosts. And C2C is Coast to Coast, and JK is George Knapp. Now, I love Coast to Coast when George Norrie is doing it. But love George Knapp. He's my fave. So George Knapp says, when Bob thought he was going to be, I probably shouldn't say this, but I'll go ahead. When Bob thought he was going to be taken out, assassinated, he had this particle accelerator in his house, and he had this container with element 115 in it right in front of it. And he was ready to flip the switch and say goodbye to Las Vegas, I think. Art Bell says, oh my God. And this is from Coast to Coast. Knapp says, I don't know if that was a dramatic gesture or what it was, but thank God he didn't do it. Art Bell says, I've never heard this. Yeah, well, it's not a pretty picture. Until I'd read this article, I had forgotten about this incident. If I had ever heard it at all, that Bob Lazar was actually threatening to blow up Las Vegas if the government moved against him by doing something with element 115, which is a fascinating story that George is relating here. So, but Eric Davis is not happy with that answer. Eric says nobody can put a particle accelerator in their home unless the house or their entire property is dozens of square miles in size. Element 115 first got synthesized by the Russians in 2003 and was internationally labeled and recognized as element 115, named Moscovium, in December 2015. Moscovium's 4 isotopes have a half-life ranging from 37 milliseconds to 650 milliseconds. So it is impossible for Bob Lazar to have any muscovite isotope in his house, nor the gigantic particle accelerators that produced it via the collisions of other large atoms. Also, a roadrunner who ran programs at Area 51 for Los Alamos told me that he knew Lazar's female supervisor at Area 51 and had her pull up his personnel file. Lazar worked as a radiation health monitor in the unsecured logistics contractor facility outside of Area 51, so he was never inside that site, and he never held security clearances because he didn't need them to work in an unclassified area. Lazar made up his entire cockamamie story about the UFO that he saw in a building inside Area 51. He was never exposed to any classified information, facilities, or programs in his work area. All this is according to Eric Davis. Now, just to address the element 115 thing, Eric is saying that humans have just discovered or invented this element in Russia not long ago. So, and we haven't been able to stabilize it. So how in the world could Bob have gotten it? I mean, I think that's a ridiculous argument, honestly, because the whole idea is that humans didn't get it, that it came from the beings. So, and off of their ships. So clearly, Bob isn't saying that he developed 115. He's saying he obtained it or even stole it from Area 51. So yeah. But moving on, Joe says, I'm sure that's news to George Knapp, and I'm not talking about the alleged particle accelerator stuff. And if Bob's story was all made up and he had no access to classified info, then why were so many people harassed or threatened when George Knapp tried to talk to them about Lazar? Are you going to tell us that George and all of those witnesses are lying too? Eric Davis says, I gave you the facts. Claims of harassed and threatened people is unsubstantiated hearsay. George is not lying. He just does not know any Roadrunner contact who lived in Las Vegas. He does not know my Roadrunner contact who lived in Las Vegas near Indian Springs and worked at Area 51 and knew Lazar's supervisor there at the time all this unfolded. Here I should also point out that Chris Mellon tells a similar story. Somebody he knew at Area 51 also told him that Bob was not a scientist working on UFOs. I forget exactly what position he was supposed to have had, but it was some menial position, if he worked there at all, which, but we'll go into that with Joe Murgia's response. But it is interesting that Eric and Chris are both getting fed these pieces of information from people supposedly working at Area 51. There is a large body of evidence to support Bob working there and having the background needed to work there. But people that do work there and that are known to actually have been there are denying this. And it's interesting that people like Eric and Chris are buying their stories. I find that fascinating. Of course, they know them personally, so they would put greater weight on their friends' and colleagues' testimony over someone like Bob Lazar, who they don't know. But, again, there's a large body of evidence to corroborate Bob working there. And, they are discounting that completely because of these people they know. Now, I don't know those guys. I know way more about Bob than I know Eric Davis's Roadrunner. So I place a lot more evidence or faith in Bob's testimony than I do Eric's. So with me, the tables are flipped there. Again, there's a lot of evidence to support Bob, and we'll get into that now. Joe says, somebody told you that somebody told them. Sounds like hearsay. Exactly. And just for the record, I don't have much time invested watching material about the Lazar story and don't have strong opinions about it/him. But when so many people, even if it's hearsay, tell George that they were harassed and threatened, I give it some weight. Appreciate you sharing what you learned. Would love it if George chimed in. George never chimed in. George Knapp. He's a busy guy, so I reached out to Jeremy Corbell and Knapp to see if they would share their thoughts on Davis's comments. Unfortunately, this time I've been unable to get a comment from either one of them, but I fully expect that to change in the near future when they've done their commitments related to Hunt for the Skinwalker and Bob Lazar, Area 51, and Flying Saucers. Of course, they're talking about Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp's two documentaries. Eric Davis was at it again a few days ago, posting on George Knapp's Facebook page after Knapp posted an article about actor Mickey Rourke narrating Corbell's film. By the way, brilliant narration. Say what you want about Mickey Rourke, but Now, his narration really made that film. That was awesome. If you haven't seen Jeremy Corbell's Bob Lazar movie, highly recommend it. It's a great movie, made even more great by Mickey Rourke's trippy narration. Eric Davis responds as if Lazar's verifiably false claims deserve a public stage. It was impossible for Lazar to do PhD level work at LANL because he only had a high school education with a C average grade. Thus, he had no education or training to be a scientist. He did not take high school physics. His job was radiation health monitor, which did not require security clearances, so he did not get access to Area 51 since his workstation was at the off-site logistics support facility, which is unclassified. He's also a convicted felon in the state of Nevada, although I believe that is supposed to be afterwards, but I could be wrong. In civil society, having been charged with and convicted of a felony crime in a court of law by one's peers directly impugns one's credibility, truthfulness, and obedience to the law. These three items go to the heart of why some people fail to earn security clearances. Lazar never had security clearances to begin with because his EG and C job at the unclassified physically disconnected Area 51 logistics support facility didn't require security clearances. After seeing some of these comments, Joe writes, I reached out to Davis to see if he could add any more thoughts or details about the Lazar story. He responded, but said he's too busy at the moment to answer my questions. When he responds, I'll let you know. To me, Joe writes, a big data point in Lazar's favor is how he knew where and when to go in order to view something in the night sky being flown over Groom Mountains near Area 51. 3 Wednesdays in a row, he took friends and family out there, and on various nights, they all saw a light that appeared to jump around like so many UFOs we've seen on video. It's hard to see any details, but something was up there. How did he know? Did he just get lucky? From the website Other Hand, March 22nd, 1989, first Wednesday night trip to Tikaboo Valley to view disc. It just gives various, those 3 times that Bob took people out there to view the UFOs. And Bob knew when these UFOs were being flown by the Area 51 guys, and he took friends out there 3 weeks in a row to go look at it. The last time they were discovered by guards and detained by the sheriff. So among the most talked about issues against Lazar are his claims that he received a master's degree from Caltech and MIT. There's no proof he attended either school, let alone received a master's degree. One of the most prominent Lazar critics has been researcher Stanton Friedman. He wrote, he was publicly asked when he got his MS from MIT. He said, let me think now, I think it was probably 1982. Nobody getting an MS from MIT would not know the year immediately. He was asked to name some of his profs. I don't know if that's true, honestly. I don't know exactly when I graduated college. 2002, maybe? I don't know. I have no clue. Yeah. That's not a clear-cut telltale sign, as much as I love you, Stanton Friedman. But anyway, getting back to Stanton's quote, Bob, was asked to name some of his profs. He said, let's see now, Bill Duxler will remember me from the physics department at Caltech. I located Duxler. He's a Pierce Junior College physics prof, junior college, and never taught at Caltech. Lazar was registered in one of his courses at the same time Lazar was supposedly at MIT. Nobody who can go to MIT goes to Pierce Junior College, not to mention the rather long commute between LA and Cambridge, Massachusetts. Good point. In a recent interview with Richard Dolan, Jeremy Corbell tried to clear up some of the mystery about Lazar's education and specifically Caltech. I have had multiple communications with somebody who has known Bob Lazar prior to Bob Lazar being known as Bob the UFO guy. This individual knew him in LA. This individual actually used to drop Lazar off at Caltech. Actually dropped him off at Caltech. So think about that for a second. So if Bob's lying about his education, lying about all that stuff, which I'm willing to accept, that has nothing to do with Area 51, I would be willing to accept that. But he was making a good show of it all the way back then when he had nothing. That's a good point. Why would Bob get his friends to drop him off at Caltech all those years ago? Was he really, pretending to his friends that he was going there and then have this huge deceit going? I mean, that's incredible. I find that very unlikely. Especially since Bob has no, history of mental illness or, what's the disorder when you have to, chronic lying, what's that called? Except in this one area where his, authenticity is questioned, there's no history of him being a chronic liar. So, I don't think that it works like that. If you have that mental disorder, you lie about a whole bunch of stuff and you'll have a history of it and people, will be aware of it. I don't buy that. His friends were dropping him off at Caltech. He probably went to Caltech. Now, Eric is saying that, he has this junior college thing. Well, in order to believe Bob's story, you really have to believe that the government made a concerted effort to wipe out the traces of his education and his employment. But George Knapp was very diligent in investigating this and was able to find things that they missed, people that knew him at Los Alamos, etc. So Eric Davis is looking at things like that might be government planted information and talking to people at Area 51 that might be in the system. That is read into the program, the Area 51 program. So, he may be getting his information from the government disinformation program. And it makes you kind of wonder if maybe he is part of it. I hate to say that because I like Eric, but either he's been hoodwinked by the propaganda or he is on the side of them. Now, I hate to say that. I like him a lot, but it would make sense for them to have brought him into the program. The same with Dr. Hal Puthoff. It would make perfect sense for one or both of them to be working with the Area 51 guys. And if so, they would be obligated to cover up for that group, the breakaway group. So just something to keep in mind. I don't believe that one way or the other, but it is something to keep in mind. Okay, so let's go on. In 2015, Corbell did some sleuthing around and interviewed physicist Robert Krangle, who worked at Los Alamos and says he saw Lazar there. Krangle says that he recognized Lazar as a physicist and they attended the same security meetings. Krangle says, well, he was a physicist, which I'm a physicist. We kind of recognize each other. It's the classic pocket condom with all the proper different color pins. Laughter. He fit that mold. If nobody would have told me he was a physicist, one look, he's a physicist. He's properly dressed in geekdom. I guess if you have a pocket projector, you're a physicist. Corbell says, did people tell you he's a physicist? Was it ever explained to you? Krangle says, in some conversations, somebody would be talking about what somebody was doing, and they'd point over there, and that's him over there. Corbell says, you have a direct individual memory of being in a security briefing at Los Alamos with Bob Lazar. Krangle says, yeah, I remember seeing him. Well, there you go. He was at a security briefing at Los Alamos. Boom. Corbell says, what was your impression of what Bob was doing at Los Alamos in the 80s? Krangle says, well, at the time I was there, I really didn't know what specifically Bob was doing. We didn't work together. We simply crossed paths, at least in glancing view. I didn't know what he was up to any more than he knew what I was up to. Corbell says, but you did know that he was a physicist. Krangle says, yes. Corbell says, and that was very clear to you that he was a physicist at Los Alamos and not, again, like the janitor. Krangle says, right. And in conversations with some of my colleagues, again, sitting over lunch, we would be talking about something happening or who's doing something. It's okay to talk amongst yourselves. You're just not allowed to tell your wife or your kids what you're doing. And somebody would lean over and say, that's Bob over there. He's working on something project. Okay, skipping ahead a little bit. As I mentioned to Dr. Davis, one of the things that makes me seriously consider the possibility that Lazar is telling the truth has to do with the many witnesses George Knapp has tried to interview about information related to Lazar's claims. Actually, after listening to one of Knapp's lectures again, it was information related to UFOs, flying disc, and or UFO wreckage at or near Area 51. Some of it is similar to what Lazar has claimed. If all of these people were lying and making up stories, why were so many of them harassed or intimidated when they offered to share what they knew? Davis calls their stories hearsay because we don't hear from them directly. But we're not in a court of law, so I have no problem considering what Knapp has said about them when I'm trying to decipher the Lazar conundrum. They were following us around everywhere we went, into bars, to work. I had a series of phone calls at the station. This really ticks me off. People were called up offering to give me additional information about Area 51. 6 people who had called to offer me additional information and agreed to be interviewed. We were visited one right after another. There was a guy who was a tax preparer. His name was Roy Biram. He did tax returns for officers at Nellis Air Force Base, and he got to know them pretty well. And they were on and out of a town trip, a little misspelling. They were on an out-of-town trip when they were sitting around drinking some beers, and these guys told him about Area 51, flying saucers, S4, the whole story as told by Bob. He agrees to tell me that story on the phone. The very next day, he gets visited. These 2 guys who said they're from the Secret Service, they said, we hear you've been issuing threats against the life of the president. They said, we hear you've been issuing threats, and we can tell you that if you're talking to the wrong people and saying the wrong things, you can go to prison. Well, he saw that as a threat because of him talking to me. And what else could it be, right? Listen, it's queued up listen here as George Knapp explains what all the other witnesses told him and how they were harassed or threatened. It's worth the time and may make you reconsider the question of whether Bob is telling the truth. Those witnesses were not the only ones who were visited after talking about Area 51 or the Bob Lazar story. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. More corroboration about people being intimidated. Got Richard Dolan. Love Richard Dolan. But this is a long article. Okay, I'm skipping ahead a little bit. It's actually an interesting story. There's a debate between Richard Dolan and Dr. John Alexander about Bob Lazar, and they have differing opinions. Both of them are very well-informed people on the whole UFO issue, obviously, especially Dr. John Alexander. But they, even though they are both intelligent, well-informed people that are, not skeptics on the whole UFO phenomenon, they have very differing views on Bob Lazar. And, I think I'll leave it there. I'll let you read this article at your leisure. I'll link to it. But you kind of get the point about that there's so many pros and cons on the whole debate that it is reasonable to have either idea. It is honestly a very fascinating situation because there is so much what I believe to be disinformation put out there by the government that is very convincing. So, people that are, very educated, like Dr. Eric Davis and many others, can reasonably look at that evidence and come away with the idea that Bob is a big fraud. However, there is so much overwhelming circumstantial evidence, stuff that the government wasn't able to erase, like people's personal memories, although they probably have that ability too, let's be honest. But these are some people they missed. That remember him as a physicist at Los Alamos, and that, went out with him to look at UFOs that were being flown by the Area 51 guys, probably the same UFOs that he was working on. Well, he was working on one in particular, but you get the point. So, so it's just a fascinating situation where there is so much debate, and there are reasonable people on both sides, and there is a good deal of evidence on both sides. I think the overwhelming evidence supports Bob's story, but it's up to you what you think. Obviously, I would be very curious to see your thoughts. So please leave your comments below and let me know what you think. Are you pro Bob or against Bob? If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up. I would really appreciate it. That would be awesome. That would make my day. It would make my day even more if you hit the subscribe button and the bell next to it to be notified of future videos. Like I said, please comment below. Let me know what you think about this video and this topic in general. I think Bob's story is one of the most fascinating stories in all of ufology. And I can't wait to see what evidence turns up next. Also, please follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and there is a PayPal button below if you want to support the channel. Until next time, Cosmic Road out.